Okay, welcome back everybody from break. We want to get started again with the afternoon session, which is going to be focused on value. And our first session we're very excited to host, and I want to introduce our moderator, Jennifer Snow, who is Director of Health Policy at Xcenda, and she will introduce the panel. But we're going to talk about value assessment frameworks, an area that the Personalized Medicine Coalition has paid a great deal of attention to, but where the personalized medicine community in general really needs to figure out how personalized medicine and value assessment frameworks should and can work together. So, Jennifer.
Thank you, Daryl. So, as Daryl said, I'm Jennifer Snow. I'm a Senior Director at Xcenda. For those of you who don't know who Xcenda is, we are a full-service, does it sound a little weird? We are a full-service healthcare consulting company that's part of AmerisourceBergen. I'd like to say we get all of the benefits of being part of AmerisourceBergen without any of the drawbacks. Our company offers scientific and commercial consulting as well as field reimbursement, but my personal passion is health policy and watching the evolution of patient coverage and access and the product life cycle, and wondering, and shaping how the external environment works for patients. So I'm glad you're here with me. It's 3:15 on a Wednesday. You guys have been listening to panels all day. So I thought I would do a little bit of audience participation. So just humor me for a minute, because the idea of being able to tell a knock-knock joke at Harvard cracks me up. So follow along. Knock, knock.
Who's there?
To whom? That's right, to whom? And that's the best segue I could come up with when it comes to value, because the question and the answer is to whom? As many of you know, over the last few years, we've moved away from talking about quality in a silo to really talking more about value and using quality along with cost as a way to quantify that value. We've had a number of value frameworks launched in the US. We've had ASCO and Drug Abacus. We've had the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER's commitment to do 15 to 20 comparative evaluations over last year and this year. And we've had the launch of the NCCN evidence blocks. But there's been a lot of criticism about the focus on cost and reducing cost rather than looking at that balance between cost and quality. And how value frameworks are going to work in the US is still kind of a mystery. How are they going to be used, and how are we going to define value as a society is unclear. And then you have personalized medicine. The evolving science of personalized medicine looks to maximize value by using diagnostic tests to identify which medical treatments and procedures will work best for each patient, which is sort of the definition of value for patients, meeting the patient where they are with the right product, right time. And I think it's safe to say that personalized medicine and value assessment frameworks have elements that both align and conflict. So Xcenda has been working with the Personalized Medicine Coalition to look at the considerations that can be applied to value assessment frameworks in terms of the personalized medicine. Things like incorporating diagnostic testing, heterogeneity of treatment effects, individual values and circumstances. And our panel today is going to be talking about how value assessment frameworks and considerations for personalized medicine, how they come together from different viewpoints. We have a fantastic panel this afternoon. So if you can, what I'm loving right now is that there's very few laptops out, so thank you. But I'd love the engagement, and we're going to be going through the line. Each one of us is going to be talking a little bit about our perspective, and then I have some questions for the panel, and then each one of them will be happy to take questions from the audience. First up on our panel, we have Steve Pearson, the founder and president of ICER. He'll be followed by Dane Dixon, CEO of Cure One, Bobby DuBois from National Pharmaceutical Council. He's the chief scientific officer and executive vice president, and Andrea Stern-Ferris, who is the president and chairman of the board for Longevity Foundation. So first up, we have Steve.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and it's a real pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to have been asked to come and talk. This has been a great meeting. I've been here since almost the beginning this morning, And I apologize, since our little screen up here isn't working, I'll have to kind of crane my neck around to see my slides. So if it's possible to get this screen working, it would be helpful. So they asked me to give a little bit of background on what I view as the the basic question: how does value assessment and the frameworks that different people are using to assess value, how does that align with the vision, with the goals, and in some ways, even the kind of the nitty-gritty aspects of the movement towards personalized medicine? And I'll just jump right into it to say, I am sure that the vast majority of people in the personalized medicine community share the same vision that people who are doing value frameworks do in general, and that is a world in which evidence starts at the bottom in terms of what good evidence should look like from the patient perspective. It's gathered in an efficient way so that rapid decisions can be made by the FDA and by payers to introduce innovative new treatments for patients. And that these treatments are used at the bedside in a way that allows doctors and patients to weigh the risks and benefits and what's known about the drug in the context of the individual patient's life and their family's life. Now, that's a vision that I really think that we all share. The question is, how do we get there, and how do we do it in a way that works within the current healthcare system, that might have to push some of those envelopes, and that is also sustainable for all the different parties who wish that vision to occur? So that's a jump ahead to in a sense, to the conclusion. I think that there is great alignment between value assessment and between the vision of personalized and precision medicine. So I was asked to talk about some specific issues, and I'm just going to mention the drug Kymriah, which I guess maybe because it's after lunch, I'll share the attempt at a joke on my behalf. So Kymriah, the drugs where the names come from, I can't escape the idea that this one is the love child of Kim Kardashian and Mariah Carey. What do you think? What do you think? Should I keep my day job? I don't know. Yeah. But you know what? How many of you read that New England Journal of Medicine article by Lisa Rosenbaum that told the brief story of Kymriah? I hope you will take the chance to do it. It is a story of the courage and the determination of patients and their families and of the clinicians and scientists. It talks about unbelievable determination through shortfalls and problems, and even some blind luck that led to the introduction of a truly innovative breakthrough treatment for patients that creates great promise. The basic clinical evidence is that for a treatment of B-cell precursor acute lymphoblastic leukemia in those under 25, these patients had historical 5-year survival rates of around 10%. And in the trials of Kymriah, 83% of patients treated had a complete response, and around 50% had serious side effects. So the pricing came out at $475,000, and this was all done, at least so far, a lot of details to be discussed, but it came out under the CMS's authority under the CMMI, and it was linked to the idea that payment would only be given when patients responded by the end of the first month, and that there was a suggestion, as you've heard already, of indication-specific pricing for future indications. So basically, when a value assessment looks at this, and ICER, we have a membership program where we basically get life science companies and payers together to try to look into the future. And when we talk and learned about gene therapies, a lot of things kind of crystallize. One is that from the value assessment perspective, we have to grapple with very small patient populations and novel aspects of how these treatments are given to patients. And both of that and other issues makes it very difficult for us to feel like we're looking at what has traditionally been called a robust evidence body. It means that often we have a kind of a variable understanding of the natural history of very rare diseases that are being treated or could be treated by gene therapies. It frequently means that it's hard to do single-arm trials, both because of the number of patients, but also because if you've got a targeted treatment and no other treatment available, it's just very hard to create the justification for certainly a long-term randomized trial. We're almost always going to grapple with surrogate outcomes because these are going to be relatively short-term trials. And we're just going to have less certainty than the average about the long-term benefits and the long-term risks of many of these new treatments. Now, that's not to say that the reason that they're so important is also because they offer truly substantial hope to patients and their families, and that these innovations can not just be life-changing, but life-saving. So a question then is, how should the evidence be evaluated and used as transparently as possible for us to understand, in a sense, how patients and doctors should think about using this, how insurers should pay for it? And so for Kymriah, one basic question is that $475,000 a reasonable price? Should it be more? Should we be paying more for that? I always think, just as a thought exercise, just use factors of 10. So this is the price that the company named at the time of launch. Why wasn't it $4.75 million, $47.5 million, or $47,500 or $4,700? How do we know? Is there any reason to try to know? How do we have this conversation? Well, that's one of the main reasons that ICER is trying to do what we do. It's to fill a gap that I think that exists in the U.S. healthcare system, has always existed, where I feel like, especially heading into this new world of personalized medicine, we need to be able to talk about the evidence in a different way. So we try to produce independent and objective evaluations to help foster that dialogue and to help hopefully link decisions and policies more to evidence and to the discussions that can happen between all stakeholders. So ICER is an independent health technology assessment group. We're based here in Boston. What we do is develop publicly available reports. Nothing's behind a paywall. It's out there throughout the procedures of making the report. There's lots of chances for public comment. And we convene independent committees of doctors, methods experts, public representatives, so that we can have the opportunity to have this discussion about the evidence, about the strength of evidence, about the questions that remain, and about how we together want to think about applying the evidence to issues of pricing, payment, coverage, education for physicians and patients. We have 3 of these groups around the country. One's in New England, one's in the Midwest, and one's in California. We've announced recently that we'll be starting a 4th one. We're not sure yet exactly where it will be located or what the specific focus will be. And just very briefly, our funding for these reports that we do comes from nonprofit foundations. That's the 78% of the overall pie. And we do have this Policy Summit program I mentioned, for which we take contributions from industry, from the life science industry, and from payers essentially equally to support the overall work that ICER does. I also wanted to mention briefly, although I hate this graphic, this is just a picture of the as it says, 32-week report timeline from soup to nuts. And you see all the yellow dots, which is where there's specific interaction between patient groups, manufacturers, and other stakeholders. But I don't like it because it looks kind of like a bunch of pit stops along the way of a freight train moving on its own volition. It's much more like we have an idea at the beginning of what topic we're going to do, and we start to meet with the manufacturers and the patients and the clinical experts to try to really figure out what the target is. And so we kind of try to get oriented, and we make sure that we're in the right direction, having learned from their experience and their perspectives. So this is an interesting, I think my slide may come out interesting here. Okay. So this is a very brief schematic of ICER's value framework. And you've already heard that there are other value frameworks out there, and we'll talk, I'm sure, about how they differ or they're similar. But as I mentioned at the very beginning, I do think it's important to cite the goal, which is sustainable access to high-value care for all patients. And ICER's reports are structured to think of this conceptually as dealing with issues related to long-term value for money and short-term affordability, because sometimes those two do not align. And the idea that you can have something that's a great long-term value, but that is hard for payers and society to afford in the short term, is very real. It's more real with treatments that have very large patient populations, like hepatitis C, but it's not something that we want to forget, even with personalized and more precise treatments, if you will. So within long-term value for money, there are 4 different conceptual categories. One is to think very clearly about the comparative clinical effectiveness information. Then we do long-term modeling of the incremental cost effectiveness of a new treatment versus best other care, best comparators. But it's important to recognize that we also want to recognize that there can be other benefits or disadvantages that might fall out, if you will, of those 2 other buckets. They may not be adequately captured in clinical trials. These might be things really important to patients and their families, the ability to the ease of use, the complexity of regimens, those kinds of things. And then the contextual considerations, which are very strong in many ways for personalized treatments, particularly when there may not have been treatments in this area before. That's an important contextual issue. There are others as well, but we want to make sure that we keep hold of these to make sure that we have places for them in our reports, places for them in the public discussion, and places for them ultimately when our work is used by decision makers. Short-term affordability is really just the potential budget impact that we try to help create a model for people to help assess. So in our discussion about what would be helpful to talk about briefly here, the idea of the quality came up because it tends to be a bone of contention about what value assessment does and how it may or may not relate to personalized treatments. So I just wanted to mention briefly that the quality is, in a sense, the core measure of health gain for patients that's used as kind of the common currency of cost effectiveness models across different kinds of treatments and different kinds of conditions. It's recommended by both US and international bodies as the best way to try to capture the added benefit for patients. And it's basically a way of taking the years of life. So let's assume you have a treatment that adds years of life, it helps extend life, and you weight that by the quality of that life. So you do that because if one drug or 2 drugs have the same ability to extend life, but one has terrible side effects, you want to capture the side effects and, in a sense, weight that length of life so that the drug that has no side effects basically has a better score. So that's what a quality is. It's an attempt to, again, reflect how much better a drug is at helping patients. And so you use this numerical system where if your quality of life is 0, you're dead. If you have 1, you have perfect health. And you take quality of life estimates derived from studies of patients, and sometimes their caregivers or even community members if that's necessary. And you basically sum that up in your quality. So that's the measure of health gain. So if a value for money, at least, requires us to ask the question, how much are we willing to pay for a certain amount of health gain? That's the question about what's your threshold. How much more should we be willing to pay? If something's a little bit better, we want to pay a little bit more. If something's a lot better, we want to pay a lot more. How do we do that kind of scaling? Well, the way that ICER does it is linked into the way that health economists here in the US and elsewhere have done this for decades. They look at it through a variety of different lenses. One is the societal willingness to pay, and the World Health Organization, the American College of Cardiology, and others, many others, have said that there's a rough benchmark of somewhere between 1 to 3 times the per capita GDP per quality. That's how much a society should be willing to pay. Anything more than that is too much. Anything lower, if you will, the cost effectiveness is better and you can pay less, then that's even a better value. There are studies of individuals, actually, surveys asking them how much are you willing to give up of your own salary to achieve better health outcomes, and a rough consensus is around 2 times people's annual salary per quality. And there's more recent, actually, empiric work going on around the world that is actually so far suggesting a lower approach to this threshold. It's generally called the opportunity cost. It's trying to look at if you introduce something new into healthcare, what might have to drop out if you have a fixed budget. Now, that's not obviously easy to do in the US context, but internationally, it's looking like that opportunity cost is closer to 1 times the per capita GDP. So our per capita GDP in the US is around $54,000, $56,000. So when ICER looked at this issue and we decided to have our threshold, we created a range because there's no one right answer. There's no one right number. But we felt that the range of $100,000 to $150,000 per quality made the best sense. It's actually kind of towards the northern end, if you will, the higher end of these different approaches. So our value-based price benchmark gets a lot of attention because we use our analyses not just to say at the given price, what's the cost effectiveness. Especially when we're looking at emerging drugs, we can use that approach and turn it on its head and say, at what price would we get that $100,000 to $150,000 per quality? So that's what we do to get our value-based price benchmark. And then through our reports and largely at the meetings, we kind of just have to reflect back and say, well, if we're getting a good long-term value, does that still raise any questions at all about short-term affordability? So that's the story behind the value-based price benchmark. Here's a snapshot of most, or not most, but at least some of the reports we've given. I wanted to give you a range. The column on the left shows the drug category, and the one on the right shows the discount from the prices after rebate. So we actually have a way of working with this consultancy that can reverse engineer in the US system all of those discounts that you've heard about that PBMs get. What's the actual price that's being paid? And from that price, if it's in red, that's the additional discount that would be needed to get to the ICER value-based price benchmark. And you can see it ranges. Some of them are very close, just a 5% more discount. Some are more. Multiple sclerosis, almost across the board. The drugs to treat that condition are priced higher than the value-based price benchmark. Some drugs in the US market are right on. We've even had some drugs that we suggest are underpriced to capture their true value. Now you'll see the personalized medicine ones here, just a couple to flag. TKIs, tyrosine kinase inhibitors for lung cancer, in our analysis, their net price was smack on the dot with their added value for patients in that lineup. However, others like the checkpoint inhibitors would require much steeper discounts, and the ovarian cancer drugs as well. So it's a mixed picture. It's true that most of the time we find in the US context that the drugs are priced higher than that alignment with added patient benefit that we think is reasonable, but not all the time at all. And I would actually say that I think the reason that the TKIs for lung cancer came out the way they did is two factors. One, there is real competition in that space between 3 different drugs. 2, those drugs are really targeted. And the checkpoint inhibitors are great drugs, but we still give it to a lot of patients who don't benefit from it. And so it's not quite as precise, that linkage of the drug to the benefit to patients. All right, 2 more slides that carry some of the key messages I wanted to leave you with before the broader other presentations. So one is, back to that first question, it really is true that the more targeted you can get with your treatment, diagnostic tests up front, figure out the right patient population that's going to benefit the most, either that means better benefit or less harm, you're going to have better value. You're going to be able to justify a higher price, if you will. We do have issues when we look at rare or ultra-rare populations, and ICER has just put out a kind of a formal statement of our modifications to our framework for ultra-rare treatments of ultra-rare conditions, and we decided to set that line at 10,000. We can have a long discussion of where that number came from. But the bottom line is that our approach is going to have to recognize that with these evidence challenges that I mentioned earlier, single-arm trials, smaller patient groups, we're going to have to ourselves take that on board because we don't want to call the evidence inadequate just because it doesn't match up with some 10,000 patient RCT. And we're going to have to think about the potential for broader value ranges than that 100 to 150,000 that we posit. And that's because, again, there are special considerations around the return on investment and other aspects of truly ultra-rare conditions that really merit a broader perspective. I'm going to probably go a little bit more quickly so we have time. So there are other challenges that value assessment will face because there are tensions when there's a first FDA approval for a targeted therapy in the cancer space in particular for the later lines of therapy. So the first FDA indication is for 3rd or 4th line, but it's targeted to a gene that the patient has at the very beginning of the treatment course. There's always going to be tension. Doctors and patients might want to use this drug earlier because it works later. Why wouldn't it work better earlier? And yet the evidence, quote unquote, isn't there. So there's always going to be some tension as evidence as kind of it evolves and as we try to move things from later line into earlier lines of therapy. Now, what's the price that fairly accounts for the added benefits when there are multiply, I mean, obviously it says multiple different patient types. I probably should have written that differently. It just means that you could almost imagine that every patient as an individual should merit a different price. For some patients, this drug is likely to be exquisitely helpful and therefore should be high price. For others, lower price. In the US system, we're still wrestling with the very basics of indication-specific pricing, and that's still looking at large groups. And so we have to wrestle with how to come up with a price. And the way that we're stuck doing it right now is to take an average. We have to average some patients it's going to work great, some it won't. And we have to come up, since the US system basically tolerates one price, a fair value-based price is going to be that blended price. Last slide. So what's in the future? First, reassessment. There is nothing that ticks people off more than an 800-page report that seems like it's the final word on something, and it's in an area where the evidence is changing every week, as we've heard on some of the panels here. The science is changing every week, and the evidence on many of these treatments changes extremely rapidly. So value assessment, and we take this as a big responsibility, we are going to try to figure out how to do much more frequent and effective reassessments. We want to be able to be better at using patient-generated data within what we do. That's going to be a key goal. We're going to have to keep dealing with the tension between early access and the uncertainty of the evidence, because it's just it's going to be true. As we get earlier access to many of these treatments, we are going to have greater uncertainty. And how we as an assessment organization and how payers and others grapple with that is going to be an ongoing future challenge. I'll leave you with two last thoughts. One is cures. Everybody is so excited about these cures. You heard Jeff Mazzaro this morning. Spark's drug. We're looking at that drug. We're evaluating the CAR T drugs. Are they cures? That'll be open to some discussion. But you heard mention at least one of the issue around value assessment in that, let's assume there's a cure for a treatment where the patients right now cost $500,000 per year. We heard about hemophilia. Multiply $500,000 per year for a teenager for the rest of their life, wrap that number up, put a little bit of an extra sprinkling on top and a bow, and that's the value-based price for a cure. It's going to be millions and millions of dollars. Is society going to want to pay all of that to the manufacturer? Because in a sense, the way that we approach coming up with a value-based price would say that's the fair price, but I'm predicting that this is going to have to be a really deep conversation, because society's going to say, why do you get to take all of those downstream savings and kind of carve them into your pot? Why doesn't society get some of that, and how much should society get? So I would keep your eyes on that space, because there is very little academic thought on that right now around the world. There haven't been that many cures. So as we head there, we're going to have a lot of discussion between the communities on how to manage that issue. So, basic message in summary: more precision, better outcomes for patients, better value for the health system. Does $475,000 seem like a fair price? Our reports on the congenital blindness treatment will be out with our value-based price in January. For the CAR T drugs, both of them, it'll be out in February. Whether that means that we're the final word, it doesn't. But at least we'll be able to have the discussion, because that's the thing that our society needs more than anything to support the future that I think that we share together. Thank you very much.
So I know I have half a dozen questions that are zooming around my head, and I'll have to hold them. Next up, we have Dane Dixon, who will be talking a little bit from the provider and payer point of view.
I joke that I've got two microphones up there so that I can speak one as a recovering payer, and then the other one as someone who's trying to advance the precision medicine space. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to talk. I've been asked to say, what do the payers think when it comes to value, from my previous hat? And I can truly say that there are many of the payers who don't know what to think. This is a complex, rapidly moving arena, and they are ill prepared to understand the complexities of precision medicine on many layers. And so what happens is we oftentimes get into what I'm going to call just general principles that may be helpful but may also be harmful when you're trying to look at how do we advance the whole precision medicine paradigm in this nation. So this is a slide this is Lee Newcomer's famous slide that Lee would share over and over again, or a variation thereof, which is, payer perspective number one, healthcare is not sustainable. The Medicare trust fund is going to run out of money in how many years? You'll notice that there are two downlines that say that, if we have a, high expenditure model or an intermediate expenditure model, the Medicare trust fund will run out of money sometime in the late 2020s. But if we have a low expenditure model, it's sustainable for a great deal longer. But that's one of the payer's perspective. We are not in a sustainable area. Second payer's perspective is this, which I think is a very unfair slide. No company, no healthcare system, or no country acts in isolation. We've got global companies, global efforts to advance science. And because of that, we go through and we say if each country was in a bubble, then we could maybe say, we can look at this and say, okay, there's problems with this. But truly, the payer community looks at this and saying, our healthcare in the United States, we get much less life expectancy than we spend for money, but it doesn't account for what may be happening in the rest of the world. And I'm not saying right or wrong, I'm saying this is just what happens. But here's where it comes down to the brass tacks, which is if you're looking at value, and value is this idea that we can make something cost less and get the same outcome. You basically can go through and say, where do you save your cost? Well, the first and the biggest area is if I can keep healthy people healthy, then I don't have to worry about going through and spending money on these individuals. Problem is that oftentimes the experiences of payers is that people are with, a beneficiary is with them for a short period of time. So why spend money on trying to do an initiative that may take 20 years to see a full benefit? And by the time a patient gets to Medicare age, oftentimes the damage has already been done. And so the healthier population approach has not been something that has been widely adopted in the United States as a value proposition. And so what we're left with is we're left with three options on how to improve the value or lower cost. The first is we can get rid of waste. Now, I hate the term waste, but I think a lot of payers would say waste is giving a treatment that makes no difference in a patient and potentially could create toxicity, other problems for that patient. And so we're giving the patient, we are creating harm, which is, primero no nocere, the first principle of medicine, above all, do no harm. And yet, all the time, we do treatments that we have no idea if they're going to benefit a patient, and we're treating a lot of patients unnecessarily. The second option, which is, which we always are looking for, is just a higher quality. We can do something with lower toxicity at the same price, or we can do something at the same price that increases some metric, whether it's quality, whether it's life expectancy, whatever it is. The last option, which is something that none of us want to see, is this idea, should we limit services? Should we somehow go through and start making a debate about which services are beneficial for some patients, a high impact intervention versus a low impact intervention? We're not to that debate level yet, but I worry at some point we could. So this is what I'm going to call the PreMolecular Era definition of value. This is a 1999 study when docetaxel became a standard of care for metastatic breast cancer. It was basically compared to an older regimen that no one uses anymore, a combination of mitomycin and vinorelbine, something I've never, that we don't use anymore. But anyway, what they found is that, yes, there was a substantial time to progression in patients with metastatic breast cancer. Now, if you break this up, you can say there's 3 or 4 different colors here on this slide. The first is the blue. The blue are patients who benefited from the older treatment. They didn't need a newer treatment because they basically, would have been, they basically received a benefit and they would not have received any further benefit. The green are people who actually did benefit from going on the new treatment, and red are the patients who derived no benefit even though they went on the new treatment. And somewhere in the middle, that kind of bluish green is what we call value. When I was in training, my attendings would say it's called the thumbprint. If you can put a thumb between those curves, then that's value. And the problem is that when you start looking at things like this, you start saying, okay, is a time to progression a valuable thing? Well, if you have a patient with metastatic breast cancer, yes, it's incredibly valuable. But this is where we start looking and start saying, okay, we have people that do benefit, we have people who don't benefit, and there are a lot of people that, in the end, there's only about 20% in this trial that absolutely do benefit from the treatment itself. Let me give you a modern-day molecular example of this. This was just published, I think, last week or 2 weeks ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, something I consider a very important study looking at patients with stage 3 melanoma who have been resected and now who have a BRAF alteration, and those patients are treated with strong BRAF dual inhibition. And what happened with these patients? And what they found is, lo and behold, 80% of the patients, so the patients in the blue, that received just a placebo did fine. 80% of patients, didn't need any treatment. 10% of patients, because they went on the combined BRAF inhibition, they're alive today. And then the red group is people who, even though they did receive the better treatment, did not benefit from it. Now, as we start talking about value, value is always saying, let's compare something that is old to something that is new. You've got to be able to make a comparison. And when we're in this molecular era, we come back and say, okay, this is a molecularly defined group of patients. The problem is all we've done is we've taken a group of melanoma patients and we've added one molecular characteristic to them. We've said the tumor has a BRAF alteration. We don't go into any other details on these patients, and we have no idea what is providing the benefit in certain patients versus what is providing the risk in the other patients, and who are the patients who didn't need anything whatsoever. And this is the promise of precision medicine. And I think the payer community understands this and grapples with this, but they don't know how we're going to get there. And I'll be frank in saying, I think we, as a community that's advancing precision medicine, we also struggle with this slide, which is this idea that if we take patients that do poorly, defined in the red category, and we're able to take individual characteristics of that patient and their disease, what I'm calling the omics of the patient, the omics of the disease, and then you take the same information from the patients that did respond to therapy, and you take the people who never needed a therapy that would have done fine if they would have received nothing, and you put it all together into a large framework with the treatment and the outcomes, and you put it into a large database, and then you can hopefully begin to tease out who fits in which categories. The problem is that we are not doing these types of studies. In the molecular era, we tend to say, let's identify an alteration that can lead to a therapy. And what we haven't done, because there's no funding, it's very complicated, we haven't gone through and said, let's really, really try to understand how each one of these patients sits and settles out in this framework. And we've got a couple of big obstacles about doing that. Ideally, there should exist somewhere in the pre-competitive space a set of genomic data that allows us to begin to aggregate and put together information about patients that not only have disease and were treated and are alive, but also patients who had disease and treated and didn't respond and died. In other words, we need a broad outcome-based set of data. People with disease, people had treatments, people had outcomes. We need to put it all together. One of our big challenges, though, right now is that we're not even speaking the same language yet. When we start looking at something such as next-generation sequencing, there's a lot of excellent laboratories that are doing a lot of very good work. The problem is if you compare them side by side with same tissue specimens, with different types of analyses, you're going to see differences. And the problem is we don't know who's right and who's wrong when it comes to clinical outcome. I'm not saying in just identifying the alteration, we just don't know. And we can say this is not something that is new. We struggled with HER2 standardization for many, many years, and that was a simple IHC testing. And so we need to recognize that one of the key elements of developing a value framework, as we start looking at comparative groups to which we can identify better or improved outcomes in patients, we need to recognize that without having standardized ways of talking about what distinguishes a patient or what distinguishes the disease in a different fashion, we may never be able to understand or tease out what makes those patients different and therefore identify who we're wasting, who is receiving a treatment they do not need. The last comment I'll make, which is something which I think is something that we are going to have to very much deal with in this nation, which is something that I appropriately put a nuclear missile silo. I look at the way we're collecting data in the United States, a lot of the way that we look at the United States Congress. If you ask a person who has their own data set and you say, would it be a good idea to collect data and collect it into a centralized, pre-competitive data set? And they will say, that's a great idea. And then you ask the question, will you give your data? And the answer is, usually there is no answer. Or we'll give a little data. And we'll give maybe certain data but not other data. And the problem is, it's kind of like Congress. We have a 12% approval rating of Congress, but yet we have a high retention of our own representatives as we continue to vote them back into a Congress that's not getting anywhere. If I was going to bring up one call to action, it is to recognize what I'm going to call the et tu brute principle of data storage. We need to look and we need to say if we're going to build these value frameworks, we've got to really identify what are ways that we can better share data. And that's where we'll end.
So thank you, Dane. Up next, we have Bobby Du Bois from NPC.
Good afternoon. So the key tenet of personalized medicine is that patients differ, and that we need to understand those differences and we need to tailor therapy accordingly to those patients. I'd like to build a case, briefly, that we need to think the same way about value. Value isn't a one-size-fits-all proposition, and if we do an assessment and all patients are supposed to fit into the same category with the same value assessment, that is very problematic. Now, why would we care? I mean, there's actually teeth to value frameworks. One is they're used by doctors to work with patients, and if the doctor doesn't realize what's important to the patient, the value proposition is not going to be right. And the payers use these to decide what patients get access to, and if the score doesn't meet a certain threshold, patients might not get that therapy. So it does really matter. So there are a variety of frameworks out there, and they generally come up with a number. This therapy provides a certain improvement at a certain cost. It's a number. Or there's a score of a 71, and a 71 is better than a 51. Okay? Now that presupposes that all patients are the same and we all perceive the same value. Now, some of the frameworks, some of the time, do stratify. Familial hypercholesterolemia might have a different value score than folks that don't have a familial origin. But within each category, there's a certain assumption that we're all the same, we all think the same things are important. And I would assert that's not the case. how patients feel about quality of life versus quantity of life, how complex the treatment is versus a simple oral therapy, out-of-pocket costs versus total costs. Patients differ on these things, and their views differ for the doctor, and those views differ from the payer. Now, that's a simple thing to say. We actually have some data to support that. So we went out to about 500 patients and doctors and payers, spoke to them about a whole series of diseases, and did what's called a conjoint analysis, where you hypothesize a treatment for a disease, and then you change certain characteristics. It's more expensive, less expensive, has better outcomes, it doesn't have better outcomes, side effects are worse, it's harder to take, it's easier to take, and you can begin to sort of get the essence of what people care about. Similar to how do you choose a car and whether the cup holders are important or they're not important. Just a couple of slides on the data. The graphs here basically depict what was most or less important to patients. And for patients with different diseases, comparing out-of-pocket cost, what does it cost me? This is a chronic therapy every month, versus efficacy. You can see out-of-pocket costs were important to patients for the first 4 diseases on the left. But for breast cancer, it was all about survival. So even across diseases, there are differences. Even within diseases, the importance of extra survival compared to all the other characteristics of a drug, there's a wide distribution. So patients within a same disease don't feel the same way. Lining up what the patients think relative to the doctors for hypertension, the ratio, what's important in terms of cost versus efficacy, the doctor and the patient have a pretty similar view. The shape of the two graphs, left and right, is pretty much the same. But if you look at other cases, it's really different. For rheumatoid arthritis, the doctor says what's really important, the one on the far right, is quality of life, and how tough the treatment burden is less important. But if you look at the one on the left side of that, it's not so different. So that the patient thinks that the regimen's difficulty is equally important to the benefit. And then comparing the payer and the patient, you can see the payer at the bottom, they have a very narrow distribution. The patients are all over the map, meaning patients differ. All right, so where does this take us? Again, I'm trying to build the case that one size won't fit all. For payers, it's important to realize that, and that if they place a number and say, well, you get access, you don't, you pay this much, you don't, it may be fine on average, but for individual patients, they're going to view it as greater value or less value, and we need to figure out how to incorporate those different views. Okay? The average isn't just the way we want to live. Doctors need to realize that their views of value and what's important may differ from the patients on these things that we don't, as doctors, typically talk about. So we need to do that. And the pharmaceutical industry, we got to start to collect the data so the doctors and the payers really know how these differences play out. So one size doesn't fit all, true for treatment, and it needs to be true for how we measure and apply value.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Andrea Stern-Ferris will be talking about the patient perspective.
That's a tall order. So thank you for having me.
All patients everywhere.
All
as if
patients
they were the
everywhere,
same.
because they're all the same.
Right.
Although I got to say that with that last presentation, I think flows very nicely into what we have to say. The first two, I got to say, were quite depressing, just because you're making assumptions about what patients want, and nobody even talks to the patients. Our comments on a lot of the frameworks are publicly documented. We've submitted them, so they're out there. And so I think I'd like to posit that we need to reframe the conversation about frameworks and where they have utility, where they don't, and what they can be used for, as well as making assumptions about patients, especially in this era of precision medicine. And I know I've got Bonnie Adario in the back who can help pipe in from the peanut gallery back there, because I know you've got a lot of opinions on this too. So we are in the lung cancer space, which is benefiting tremendously from precision medicine and immunotherapy. So a lot of these things are sort of at the forefront, and a lot of the data is new, which is part of the problem, is there's not a lot of data out there. So I kind of decided to take a step back and go back to the dictionary. My mother was always one of those go look it up type of people. So I went back to the dictionary to look up what is the definition of value. And I think this, what you have on the board here is, this is from the Oxford English Dictionary, and it just clearly outlines the fundamental problem, is there's not a clear definition of value. The first two have to do with money, with budget, the material or monetary worth of something, the worth of something compared to a price paid. But then the second two get more into, I think, the patient side of the value, the regard that something is held in or deserved, the importance, worth, or usefulness, or the principle or standards of one's behavior and one's judgment of what's important in life. And I think this part of it is what drives a lot of the inherent conflict when we're asked to comment on value frameworks, is because people are coming at it from very different perspectives. And I think we need to decide on what it is, call a spade, and decide either it is to determine a price, or it is to be a shared decision-making tool, or a combination thereof. But I don't know that we have had that clear definition yet in any of the frameworks that exist. So then I said, okay, what's the definition of a framework? And I went to the business dictionary, I think had the most concise one. And it's a broad overview, outline, or skeleton that serves as a guide. And I think that's a key piece of this. That can be modified, also another key piece, as required by adding or deleting items. It's not an equation. It's not a model. It's a framework. It's a structure by which we can help make and support decisions. So then the question becomes, can they exist together? Does it exist? Can we create a value framework? Is there such a thing? And again, I think we just need to be very clear on what it is we're trying to accomplish. I think if what we're trying to accomplish through these frameworks is to establish different data points that can be used as a shared decision-making tool to use with patients, you'll get great outcomes, and that it is possible to do. And you will save costs, because it's been demonstrated, and there's data and it's cited, that when a clinician has a conversation with a patient and it is shared decision making, sometimes patients forego very aggressive treatments. It just doesn't align with their values and what they want to accomplish out of their treatments. And you get much better results. There's reduced stress, reduced outcomes. So I do think that it can exist, but not in the current way that we're using the term. Some of the things that I think we need to consider, and they've been well documented and we've commented on them, and I think some of the comments were made today, is currently there's very little alignment between patient priorities and the metrics used in the frameworks. The frameworks rely on clinical trial data. It's the data that exists, it's out there, but it doesn't reflect what the patient, firstly, it doesn't reflect the true patient population, nor does it reflect what the patients truly want out of their treatments and out of their therapies. Patients take a much longer term approach to their treatments and the related decisions than is captured in these frameworks. They think, how am I going to live 3 years, 5 years? How am I going to string things together? How do you capture that in the current models that exist? I think I might have gotten this from your study, Bobby, but patients prefer hopeful gambles to safe bets. And this, too, has been documented. Whereas a clinician will go with the safe bet of knowing what the outcome is going to be, a patient will often, if there's a chance that it's going to be the long tail of the curve and they're going to be in there, they'll take that chance, particularly in cancer and some of the more fatal diseases that exist. Incorporating combination or sequencing of drugs. In the lung cancer space, this is huge. This is how people are staying alive. They're staying alive because they're on a treatment until it gets them to the next one. And they're putting 4, 5, they're putting clinical trials in there, and they're staying together. So again, I don't know, it's not currently being modeled, but if we truly want to reflect the value of something and assign cost or price or what's reimbursable or how this should be incorporated into a treatment paradigm, I think that we can't do it without considering these things. Treatment-related preferences and priorities evolve over time. Steve, I think you mentioned that as well. So how do we continue to use this and to go back to these models to continue to evolve them as new data becomes available, as more patients are using it, as the knowledge of how to use it and which patient populations to use them in is refined as well. And it's been stated many times, one size absolutely does not fit all. This next slide, I'm more than a number. I think if you ask any of these patients, they would have a real issue with qualities. I know I do, and I know a number of other patients do. Everybody up here has benefited from an immunotherapy or a chemotherapy. That top with Jim Morrison, he's holding up 10 fingers, and the lady with him is 3. That's how long they've been alive as a stage 4 patient. David Gobin's in the middle. He was one of the first patients on nivolumab. He has been off therapy for 2 years and still is stable. So where is that captured? Where are these people who have strung things together or who are living on the targeted therapies and immunotherapy? Where is that captured in these models, and how do we do that? And so again, I think that we need to remember that these are people. They are individuals. They have individual preferences. They have small children. Many of the people who are benefiting from the targeted therapies skew younger, and they do really, really well on the targeted therapies. But they also, most importantly, they're working. They're paying their taxes. They're contributing to their health insurance plans, and they're participating in their life. They're watching their kids grow up. So I think that they would definitely want to be known as more than a number. And I think, Bonnie, you might have even said that in some of the things that you've published as well. So with that, just wanted to give a different perspective, ask us to reframe the framework conversation, not to forget to include the patient in that conversation, and hopefully we will get to a much better result. So thank you.
Orange who? Orange you, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I got it. Orange, I'm glad that Andrea's not asking you the first question. So no, the question is, how can the patient community engage with ICER or other, folks doing value assessments to kind of push to be able to incorporate more of kind of their thoughts into the process? Is there a way that you already work with them or that they could be more involved, or what are your suggestions?
Sure, great question. Each of the frameworks was created with different purposes and different audiences in mind, and I completely agree with Andrea that clarity about that is very important because it's so confusing. There are so many of these different frameworks. They're operating in different ways. People have been trying to figure out both what's in them and who influences them and what they're used for. And the divide that she identified is, I think, the critical one. There are others, but is a framework primarily intended, and I think it really has to be clear, to help the individual patient and doctor at the bedside? Or is it primarily intended to guide what I would call population-based decision-making, policies, et cetera? Because you want them to look different, you want them to function different. Both of them have really critical ways that the patient community needs to be involved, but they're just very different animals. One easy example is, and I actually created one when I was a practicing physician, if you want to create a decision aid for a doctor and a patient, you don't want to sum a lot of things up. You want to leave them disaggregated because you want the patient and the doctor to see them separately so that the patient can put different weights, if you will, not even if they're quantified, but just to see them and consider them very separately. If you are trying to come up with an assessment that's going to inform a population decision, like coverage is a population decision. It can have more nuances or less, but it's kind of at the population or pricing. You frequently need to sum that up in some way. You don't want to lose the heterogeneity and make sure that people can see it because it is important, but you do have to kind of sum some of these things up to be able to compare apples to apples. So that distinction is critical. And then for patients, I can speak actually mostly obviously for ICER's experience, which has been a long and continuing growth curve of trying to understand how we can work with the patient community. The patient community itself is far from homogeneous. Some patient groups are incredibly sophisticated. They have the ability to generate their own data. They sponsor their own research. They know all this. Others are very small groups, individual families, survivors or their family members. And they're just you need different ways to help them engage. And what we've had to learn is how to make our ask as clear as possible, because we need to be able to say, here's what we hope to learn from you. And it includes very much what matters to you. The clinical trials may have measured this. In multiple sclerosis, it's relapse rate. What matters to you? Patients told us functional ability to work. One person said quite clearly, I don't care if I have a relapse every week, if I can manage that and get to work, because the two are kind of correlated, but not completely. So we had to shift our approach in our modeling and in our review to emphasize the data that was not the key data in a lot of the clinical trials, and that's difficult. So there's that orientation at the beginning that's really, really critical. And it continues on through as we kind of keep checking back and trying to get input. And it gets harder because a lot of the details of a systematic review, a network meta-analysis, it's harder for the average patient group to kind of know how to critique that. So anyway, I think there are lots of important ways, but for us it starts with trying to be better at understanding how to get them to help us understand the diversity of the experience. Don't let us, even though some of us are clinicians, get stuck in our own memory of what it was like to care for somebody with that condition. Paint the full palette for us and make sure we keep as broad as possible.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, please.
I think an important piece of that, and I applaud you for evolving your process, because when lung cancer went through it, it wasn't quite as evolved as it currently is. So it was a slightly different experience. But I think a key piece of what you said is not to elicit the information, but to listen to the information and to incorporate that in, particularly when these frameworks, in some circumstances, are used for policy decisions or as data points, because it has the real potential of restricting access. And that is the biggest crime that we can commit, particularly in this time, in this period, in diseases where there has been no progress for so many years, when there is just this proliferation of advancement, to put a halt to that based on inadequate data, inadequate evidence, putting the wrong, and prior to doing this, I had a software company that was a decision support software company, so I know what it takes to do it, but I also know that garbage in is garbage out. And when we have that and it's coming out as an answer, it's a real problem.
Yeah. Just one quick comeback on that. So yeah, I totally agree. I mean, our reports are not used as a kind of one thing that makes a decision for payers. They look, obviously, and other decision makers look at a broad spectrum of input. We hope to do a more rigorous, in some sense, academic job looking at the evidence. But it can either be viewed as a break or as a way to channel the innovation in a way that will actually lead to better access. So we've had companies now starting this year. We had a public example of a company that came to us before FDA approval, before they named a price. They worked with us, with our modeling. Everybody thought they were going to price it here on the market. It was already being talked about. And using our modeling and working with their own folks, they said, and they went to the payers, and they said, look, if we price it down here, can we get better access to this drug for the patients who need it? So there was a real win-win, I think, for patients and the system and for the innovator.
I think it's evolving.
And it absolutely is. So the risk of this leading to a full stop no is out there. And I will say, I hate to use this as a spook tactic, and it's because it's not meant that way. But gene therapy, right now, there are many large employers, the self-insured employers, working with their health plans to write their benefit designs for next year that will exclude coverage for gene therapies, full stop. Whether they work, whether they don't work, whether they're expensive, whether they're cheap, they're going to carve it out as a set of techniques that are not covered. There is a brick wall that our system can end up at where innovation and affordability don't work out. And my hope is that we can contribute to the kind of conversation with patients at the center that doesn't end up in that kind of outcome.
So I know we have a question from the audience. Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. My name is Bonnie Adario, and I also have two lung cancer foundations. I agree, healthcare cost is way too high. But I think there are many reasons for that, aside from the cost of pharmaceutical drugs. I also participated in writing a patient value framework, a global one, with other patient advocacy groups around the world across disease types. And I would love to see it up there right next to ASCO's and everybody else's. Because I ultimately believe that the patient is everyone's customer. The pharma's customer, the payer's customer. They are the ones that are paying a whole lot of money for all of these things as well. And their voice needs to be a critical part of the solution. A critical part of the solution. They should be sitting at everyone's table, helping to decide what we do about the high cost of healthcare. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark Williams, Geisinger. We've heard a lot about value this afternoon, which has been great. I had to rise to something that was in Dr. Dixon's slide, and it will actually tie back into a question, I promise. But on one of the slides said that prevention saves money. And the issue there is from whose perspective? From the healthcare system's perspective, prevention doesn't save money, and that's been shown. There's a Dutch study that shows that if you're a normal weight, non-smoking Dutch male, your incurred healthcare costs after age 21 are 250,000 euro. If you're an overweight, non-smoking Dutch male, your incurred healthcare costs are 220,000 euro. And if you're a smoking overweight Dutch male, your incurred healthcare costs are 150,000 euro. Dead people don't incur healthcare costs. Okay, so prevention, keeping people healthy and living, incurs costs. Now, society benefits from this because you're productive, you're contributing to society, and as you pointed out, you're contributing to premiums in that, but it doesn't offset the costs that are actually incurred from healthcare. So bringing it back to the conversation that we had earlier, if you think about those two gene therapies, the gene therapy to cure blindness versus curing hemophilia, from a payer perspective, the hemophilia one is a dead solid no-brainer because I'm going to save $400,000 of utilization annually. Right. Being blind doesn't incur a ton of healthcare costs. There is increased utilization, I'm sure, but it's not of the magnitude of $400,000 per year. But society has a tremendous benefit from that individual retaining vision. But we don't get credit for that in the healthcare sector when we do that. So the question is how do we deal with the issues where the people that are actually valuing are not necessarily the ones that are paying?
Well, I can take a whack at that. I completely agree, and it's not just the health systems that don't get credit for it. The pharmaceutical industry, by and large, doesn't get credit for it. We're doing a study right now to really understand that question because people will provide lip service. Oh, your drug can return you to work. You're more present at work. That's wonderful. What's the price? Can you make it cheaper? And we're trying to figure out why people aren't giving credit to that. And it's complicated. If you talk to a company that's like a white-collar company, they'll say things like, yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. But in reality, if somebody is kind of goes home early because they don't feel well on Wednesday, you know what? They'll work on the weekend. So in the end, there is no productivity loss. Or if you talk to people that have a large union population, I mean, it's like you can't just hire and fire people. It's way more complicated. You know, if you had a single payer system and you asked all the people, should we incorporate? Of course, but in our pluralistic system, it's a mess. You would think the employers would be the first standing in line, but they have turnover too, so they don't see it. So it's a real problem, but if we can't solve it, this whole system isn't going to work.
I would also say, I mean, it's interesting, my wife is an occupational physician, and there are many employers in the manufacturing trades who do get that. And they're very willing to do that MRI on day one on that low back pain, get them to physical therapy, get them expand. They even say operate earlier. We want them back to work. Now maybe you feel like that's not the way that we want to treat patients, but there is a view to that. One of the broader ethical challenges of value assessment is linked to what you say, because the blindness is a great example. It seems like a no-brainer that we would want to view the broader perspective. What's happening to the family? Are family members having to stay home with the child? What about education costs? Can they go to a regular school? How do we capture all of that? To a certain extent, that makes a lot of sense and is intuitive, and we want decision makers to think about it. We want them to push out, not just to think about drug costs, we want to think about all health system costs, and even more broadly. If we get serious about productivity, it raises a challenging ethical question, which is, does this mean that treatments for those over age 65 should be devalued in relation to treatments for young, healthy, working adults? Do we take money away if you will, or do we somehow lack priorities for treatments of people who are takers in our society? You can imagine the slippery slope that puts us on. So all I'm saying is that this is the kind of discussion we have to have around value and around how we manage our health system, because we don't want to send a signal to innovators not to go after conditions that have huge social kind of impact. Opioid problems, pain, there are things out there, mental health. We have to be able to capture that value.
So you have time for 2 questions before the hook comes out. So I'll ask both folks at the mic if you each can ask your question.
Just very briefly, in order to pay for the more cutting-edge, expensive things, we really need to lower the cost of the everyday, mundane, chronic diseases and stuff. And I've found I make more advances when I spend more of my own money seeing people outside of my network and things not covered by anyone. So would there be a way, what I'd like is Harvard Holistic and Tufts Total and Geisinger Global and Kaiser Comprehensive, where I get to play with a little of the money I save by not doing the things that really didn't work and actually made me sicker at times through side effects, to play around with lab-developed tests and a functional medicine consult and figure out this dental piece so it's not causing the problems that you have to pay for curing. And, and I know it sounds very unorthodox, but health insurance is so different from house insurance. If my house burns down, you don't tell me how I have to build it. I can only use this. I understand medicine is very different, but in the patient perspective, we really are learning things together, and you're not always right. So as we do leading edge as opposed to lagging edge things, it's lagging by the time it's proven. So any thoughts on, are things loosening up at all in this regard?
They are, but probably not enough. One is the HSA concept. You do have a kitty, and you do have a much broader access to the money to do some of the things you absolutely just mentioned. The second is there are some employers that are working towards sort of episode payments, and if you can save money, then you share, they share. There's also ones where they'll pay a certain amount for an MRI scan. If you go to the expensive one, you pay more. You go for the cheap one, et cetera, et cetera. So there are some. I think it's nibbling at the margins.
Jonathan Romanowski from Inflamatics. We're a new diagnostics startup. So I'm actually sitting here seeing how jealous I am as a diagnostics company that you actually have a value framework to consider payment. I mean, diagnostics are paid by sort of a formula based on activity. And I know that the PMC and others have tried to change that, and actually there have been a handful of successful diagnostic companies that, frankly, due to fortune that their steps didn't fit into an existing framework, they were able to extract value-based pricing. But that seems kind of ridiculous to me. I guess, what's your perspective, and maybe I'll ask a question to ICER. Do you consider diagnostics, and is there consider a value for diagnostics? And one last comment is, for many of these personalized therapies, there was a diagnostic that helped derive that. Now, why can't the diagnostic be the $100,000 price, and the therapy be at the $4,000 price?
So if you'd come to the Wizard of Oz looking for a heart, I'm afraid I can't give you a heart. Much less a brain. We are as locked into the insanity of the history of payment and coding around laboratory tests as anybody else. When we look at value, we kind of lump the two together. When we looked at checkpoint inhibitors, we just we did ask, how much is the test? We wanted to make sure we captured the full cost. But we weren't asked, and I don't know if it would have helped for us to split that out and say, well, you can't use all the downstream benefits. You don't get any of those unless you pay something up front. Your question is really good. And all I can say is that we do have a separate framework for the hierarchy of evidence with diagnostics, because we know you don't expect large RCTs for diagnostics, except in some situations. But as far as teasing out the specific value as compared or in distinction to the treatment linked with the test, I don't think we have a good framework for how to do that. So it might clearly be something that is on the agenda for us to work together on over the next few years, because we all want the tests that would lead to more personalized medicine to be incentivized in a way that will lead to the kind of innovation we want.
Can I just make one comment? The diagnostic companies, the biggest problem you run into is what do you compare yourself against? You can't do a randomized controlled trial. And so you're left with sometimes the payers are looking and saying, okay, we want you to do a randomized controlled trial. You can't do it. And so we have to think of new frameworks. And when I say new frameworks, it's new data collection frameworks. And one of the things that I think once it could benefit would be if you had the ability to say, okay, I'm a diagnostic manufacturer. I know what happens with this group of patients when they have had outcomes based on a traditional diagnostic, whatever it is. And now we can apply our new diagnostic, and I can compare our outcomes to a historical control. But at least I've defined out those historical controls. I mean, that's what I see as a sustainable method for our diagnostic industry, because right now the current paradigm is you've got to do trials that there is no funding to be able to do. There's not enough time. The field is evolving so rapidly that there's no way we can keep up. We can't allow frameworks to take money out of the system. We've got to use our diagnostics and our personalized medicine to improve the system and keeping the cost at probably a pretty similar place where it is right now.
Thank you all very much today for hanging in there on our panel, and thank you, my esteemed panel.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you to all of the panelists for that great discussion about value assessment frameworks. We're going to continue the conversation about value, and we're going to talk about programs and projects for implementing personalized medicine and how they can demonstrate value and hopefully provide some evidence for decision-making on personalized medicine care. I'll introduce our moderator, and then I'll actually take my seat and participate on this panel. But this session will be moderated by Mike Polini, the founder of Foundation One.
Thanks, Daryl. And I just want to tell everyone that you can't imagine the amount of infighting went on for this coveted 4:30 spot today. It was a battle. So I'm going to dive right in and come to the first question of the session. I'd like each of you to comment on what you think of this 4:30 time slot. So we can look at it glass half empty or glass half full. I think the real reason that we were selected in the 4:30 time slot is because we know that you're all charismatic. We know that you're going to bring a lot to the table, and we know that you're going to keep everyone entertained until 8:30 p.m. tonight, because that's when the session goes to now. So we're going to kick this off. Actually, before I dive into the panel, I do want to comment, take advantage of being the moderator for the final panel of the day, and I want to comment on the PMC because today's been a tremendous day. We've had I've been to the PMC meeting for many years now, and I think today was one of the best days that I've ever been part of, and a lot of work that goes into the conference itself. But there's a lot of work that the PMC has done over the course of the past year, and so I just want to say thanks to Ed and the entire team, because we've accomplished a heck of a lot. Which also sets up the announcement that Ed asked me to make, and that is that no one will be allowed to leave this room tonight unless you have signed up to be a PMC member. So just make sure of that as well. Our topic tonight, or our topic this afternoon, is clinical utility, and it's really the clinical utility proposition. So as I think about it intuitively, I think we all know, there's value in personalized medicine, right? We're 100% certain of that, kind of in the heart. We also know when we see these anecdotal patient stories in our businesses, in our lives, and we see the benefit, again, we know we have 100% certainty that there is value in personalized medicine. When we see the individual clinical studies emerge, again, we know there is value in personalized medicine. And we've heard today, going back to the first discussion of the day, pharma understands there is value in personalized medicine. But I think we're faced with the reality that knowing it in here, even if we all know it in here, it's simply not enough. We have to work together to prove it. And that's really going to be the focus of this last panel here today, is how do we work together, first to acknowledge the challenges that we're all facing here, but then how do we work together to prove once and for all that there's value to personalized medicine? And in so many ways, it's really an ideal way to wrap up today's sessions. So in a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Lincoln Nadald, who is the Executive Director of Personalized Medicine and Personalized Genomics. By the way, I love the personalized genomics at Intermountain Health. David Roth, founder of Van Halen. No, that's David Lee Roth. I'm sorry. So I had to. Sorry, it came to mind earlier. So I said we have to mix it up. It's late in the day. So Chair of Pathology and Laboratory Medicine at University of Pennsylvania and Director of the Penn Center for Personalized Medicine. And then pitch hitting and cleanup today is Daryl Pritchard, SVP of Science Policy at the Personalized Medicine Coalition. So today's focus, actually Dane's comments at the end, really go to the core of the matter, and that is there is a data gap. There's a data gap between the organizations, both academic organizations, for-profit institutions, and others, who are developing advanced diagnostic laboratory tests, and payers. It's just a reality. It's also a reality, as Dane just said, that randomized clinical trials are not going to occur in our world. Now, maybe maybe our panel will disagree with that, but I think for the most part, that's a true statement. And this data gap is just not good for anyone. It's certainly not good for the test developers, okay? It's not good for the pharmaceutical companies as they think about the future of their medicines that are dependent on our tests. It's not good for the physicians as they try to treat their patients. It's certainly not good for patients and patient care, and it's not even good for the payers, and they understand that as well. So I think in many ways we actually can get aligned here if we simply acknowledge some of these challenges. And as I think about an example of this, and this is an example in oncology, I was in DC about a month ago at a dinner meeting, and Francis Collins was there, and the host of the meeting asked Francis to say a few words. And he said, one of the things that he said is, if somebody's diagnosed with cancer today, the first thing that should be done is they should get their tumor genomically, molecularly assessed. Now, that's a starting point for selecting the right therapeutic. So if that's the end game in cancer, and there's an analogous situation in every other disease, how do we get from where we are today to there? And so that's going to be, again, the focus of this panel. So the first step is acknowledging the situation, acknowledge the issue. It's real. We all have to face it. I think we understand that. Step number 2 is to work together to find a solution. And the reason that I'm hopeful everyone leaves here in about an hour or so with a sense of optimism is because what you're going to hear is there are organizations that are already clearly working on solutions, not in some type of hypothetical world, but they're doing it within their organizations. That's what you'll hear from Lincoln, that's what you'll hear from David, and then you'll hear Daryl describe a collaborative effort led by the Personalized Medicine Coalition and also Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center. So first, I guess I'll go immediately to my right and start with Lincoln. And let's spend the first part of the discussion not talking about solutions, but let's talk about some of these challenges that will actually set up some of the solutions and specifically what you're doing in your own organization. So Lincoln, I'd ask you, and then I'll ask David and Daryl to do the same thing. I'd like you to talk about some of the challenges that we see in 2017 that you even see within Intermountain Health as you try to implement personalized medicine. But before you go there, go back to, you're coming down off of the mountain at Snowbird, you're going back to work, and somebody says you're going to direct this personalized medicine effort. And when you got into it, when you really started to figure out all the pieces that you had to stitch together within Intermountain Health to accomplish this, what did you see, and then how did that help inform some of the solutions that you've worked through over the years?
Yeah, the first thing I always tried to do was not leave the mountain at Snowbird. But whenever I made that mistake and then found myself contemplating the challenges that existed, the 3 that I felt like were really the biggest challenges, and I've thought a lot about this, and there are a whole host of challenges that we have faced when implementing precision medicine, not only at Intermountain, but I know that others across the country have faced similar challenges. The 3 that we found were, first of all, the interpretation, meaning you can do a genomic analysis, but for the most part, frontline medical oncologists, and we'll just use the cancer case initially, frontline medical oncologists are not prepared currently to really interpret those tests very well. Outside of KRAS and BRAF and EGFR, finding an amplification in FGFR2 really can throw a lot of these colleagues for a loop, and it's not clear what to do with that, if anything. So interpretation was a big deal. The second thing was implementation. We could talk about precision medicine for cancer patients, but then really actually doing that and going beyond just getting a test report and then going all the way to the end of the road and helping patients get treatment and monitoring their outcomes and comparing that to what we would have anticipated for that patient, that was a whole set of challenges that I think we still haven't totally solved, honestly. And then the third big challenge was success metrics. And implementing precision medicine, just as Mike said, I think we know that there's value there. But how do you measure that and present it in a way that administrators understand and that our colleagues at health plans understand and is in their language that they can consume and understand and digest is really difficult. And so we can talk more about how we overcame each of those. But those three were really challenging. I'm sure others here have faced the same thing.
And what was the ask when so what year did you start in this position? What year did you start this effort? And what was the initial ask that you had to perform or that you had to deliver upon?
So I started in 2013, about 4.5 years ago, and the ask from Intermountain to me was, let's implement precision medicine for cancer patients. And that was it. It was kind of fuzzy. And I think they didn't know for sure what they wanted. I actually think it partly felt like kind of a marketing opportunity, right? Like we'll be able to say we're doing precision medicine. We keep hearing our colleagues talk about that.
We've got a good-looking doctor here. We'll put him out there front and center.
They couldn't find the good-looking doctor, so they came to me next. And I think honestly it was kind of like this get caught up in the momentum sort of thing. But I knew that the first thing that was going to come eventually was, well, what are we getting for this? We've been investing and our patients benefiting. And at a place like Intermountain, and I know other systems are the same way, you have to be able to demonstrate do patients do better and what does it cost? And honestly, those are the two major questions. What are patient outcomes like and what is the cost? And so we actually asked that question, and we looked not only in the progression-free period, but also in the overall survival period. And the overall survival analysis actually is just accepted. It'll be published any day now. But we found that in the overall survival analysis of patients who got precision medicine and a matched cohort of patients who got the next line of chemotherapy, and on average, these were cohorts of patients who'd had 3 previous lines of treatment. So they were very heavily pretreated, refractory patients. We saw a doubling in the overall survival period. So they had a 52-week survival when they got precision medicine compared to about a 26-week overall survival when they got the next line of therapy. And when we looked at the cost, there was actually a savings of about $750 per week. Now the catch there, and Mark made this point so well, it was $750 per week per patient per week of survival. So they lived twice as long, which meant it actually cost twice as much, right? It would be a lot cheaper for me to get hit by a bus today than to live for another 40 years. But these patients did better per week of life. And so that was the ask from Intermountain. Implement precision medicine. A delayed ask was, what is the value that we're getting out of this? And the answer, we believe, has been, we're getting better outcomes and it doesn't cost as much on a per week of survival basis.
And we'll come back to how they were able to accomplish, how under Lincoln's leadership they were able to accomplish that feat and really answer some of those important questions. David, I already had my fun, so I'll ask you to start and really talk about the beginning as you got involved in the precision medicine initiative at UPenn. I mean, what did you see when you walked in the door? What were your objectives, and what are some of the challenges that you faced implementing those objectives?
Well, I'll go back to when I first walked in the door at Penn Medicine. I was offered the chairmanship of the Department of Pathology and Lab Medicine. I said, yeah, but what can I do for fun? And so they gave me a ridiculously small amount of money to set up next generation sequencing. And we found we had this competitor called Foundation Medicine, but we managed to
friends.
survive. And we've done, I think we've done tens of thousands of patients now. We probably have 5,000 or so non-small cell lung cancer patients sequenced. And so I'd say one of the challenges we face, is frankly payment. And one of the things that is particularly difficult in terms of interpretation is that we don't get paid to use our brains. We get paid for the technical utilization of the test, and we actually get reimbursed almost enough to cover the costs currently. But for a several $1,000 test, the physician who's interpreting it gets $30, or maybe $50. And some of these are really complicated. It can take a very long time, which is why we have avoided exome sequencing, because there's no way we could afford the interpretation. So one of the big challenges is interpretation and payment to support that. So a few years after I was able to build something on a shoestring, Penn said, could you build something else on a shoestring? Let's do precision medicine. And in that effort, I will speak about another famous rock musician, Peter Gabriel, who is one of my collaborators at Penn Medicine. He's a radiation oncologist who's interested, I'm serious, he's interested in the value question. And so we decided, as part of the Precision Medicine Initiative, to look at the first 1,000 lung cancer patients that we had, non-small cell lung cancer patients that we had sequenced, and determine what was the effect on the people that had actionable mutations, how many of them got treatment. Because another challenge, I think Jay Flatley mentioned it this morning, getting physicians to do anything different. Usually they have to either age out or die to get them to do something different, right? So that was a challenge, but in this sense we had a very motivated and relatively small group of lung oncologists, and we're able to sort of herd them into doing a treatment pathway. Another big challenge there is data, trying to get usable data for these purposes out of an EMR. We could spend hours talking about that. Trying to get cost data, if you want to find out what was the impact on cost, the cost data are walled off in a completely separate system. In fact, Peter had to go into he had to go into the EMR, he had to have residents and medical students searching charts because we don't have structured data, as was mentioned this morning, and a lot of these things, what happened to the patient, what drug did they get, not so obvious from the EMR. I won't mention the name of the company, but it begins with an E. And yet another challenge is that the financial data are walled off, and I think that the leaders of academic medical centers have remarkably little knowledge of how much things actually cost. It's sort of surprising, but I think that's the way it is. So there's a separate system for the financial data, and there's a separate system for the specialty pharmacy, which is where we had to break into that system in order to be able to get data on those drugs and that cost. So there's really a lot of things that have to be harmonized to get to the answer, was this effective, and what was the effect on cost? And we can go back and I'll tell you the answer.
I think one of the interesting things to think about as we listen to both Lincoln as well as David is that we all face these exact same challenges. We just face them from a different perspective, whether you're representing a company, whether you're representing a payer, whether you're representing it's complete, or a closed health system, whether you're representing an academic university, an academic institution. And so I think it'll be really interesting in a moment as we transition into some of the solutions. Daryl, I'm going to turn it over to you for a moment. I don't have any jokes for you, so I apologize. But hopefully you can come up with one. And one of the, I think, as the PMC has matured over the years, PMC has really tried to not just be a voice to some of these issues and educate, but to also try to pull us together to come up with some solutions. And one of the Daryl's going to speak about one of those solutions right now. It's not quite ready I think, to be published, but the data is emerging. And so Daryl's going to tell us a little bit about an initiative that was started by the Personalized Medicine Coalition a little over a year ago, which is coming to a head. And it's all yours.
Great, thanks. And I'll just start by saying if I'm going to get sequenced, I obviously want to go to Penn. so that I can go to the concert with Peter Gabriel and
There
David
you
Roth.
go.
I mean, as somebody whose formative years was in the 80s, that would be a concert that I would not want to miss, for sure. So the Personalized Medicine Coalition has to kind of look at some of the challenges in this data gap that we've been talking about from the perspective of the entire community. And really what I view it as, and what I think has been communicated before, is really what I call this access evidence conundrum. And that's that the decision makers who are providing access to these personalized medicines for patients, the providers, the professional groups that are developing clinical practice guidelines, and the payers, they need evidence to show that this works before they develop these practice guidelines, before they order a diagnostic test for their patient, before they cover a diagnostic test and determine the reimbursement level for it. They need proof that some kind of convincing evidence that it works. But this evidence doesn't come from clinical trials. I mean, randomized clinical trials are bad at really demonstrating clinical utility. They want the information about the utility, and for that you need practice-based evidence. And in order to get practice-based evidence, you need access to these technologies. So it's a chicken and the egg. What comes first, the access or the evidence? So we need to think of creative ways to develop that evidence outside of the ways that have been done, these long randomized clinical trials, and that we're not going to be able to do as a community. So some of the ways that are being considered, there's learning health systems, where we can aggregate massive amounts of data quickly and immediately so that it can be used. And there's a lot going on in there. And there's also economic modeling, which the Personalized Medicine Coalition is working with the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center to develop a model that will be a resource of evidence about the value of tests. But the key thing is that these must be useful for payers and providers. Models can be looked at suspiciously, so it needs to be developed in a way that has value and can be used by the payer community if we're going to want them to use that evidence to cover tests. The model that we're developing, and that our colleagues at the Fred Hutch Cancer Center, led by Dr. Scott Ramsey, is developing, really takes a look at those who got next-generation sequencing testing and their clinical and cost profiles, had their clinical benefits and the costs associated with that, versus those that did not get next-gen sequencing, who had standard of care. Our first phase of the study is to look at non-small cell lung cancer, and that's largely because that's where most of the data is that we can look at right now, but we intend to scale and do it in other areas as well. A key thing in making this useful is that the model is populated with data from Flatiron Health's database, which reflects electronic health records from community hospital systems. And we'll probably talk a little bit about why that's an important component of developing this model, and what some of the information and the data that we get from this study, the results we get, how it can be used. But most importantly, we have a steering committee which includes prominent oncologists from around the country, and we also have another payer advisory committee that we can share the model design with and the results to make sure that we are working towards something that is useful for the payer community. As Mike mentioned, the data is not yet published, but what we're seeing through this model development and the inclusion of payers and providers in developing the model is that there's the potential for great clinical benefit and great cost benefit of next-gen sequencing if used appropriately. And we're finding that there are some questions. What we need to do next is to bring back our payer advisory group to take a look at the results as they come in, to make sure that we are communicating them in the way that's most beneficial for the community. We also can use this data to look at some of the practice elements. One of the things that we found is that a lot of the identified actionable mutations that we see from next-gen sequencing from those patients, those lung cancer patients who got next-gen sequencing, didn't lead to targeted therapies for them. And that leads you to wonder why, and we can now take some of that information that we're getting from this value study and start asking questions about how do we best implement this into practice. The first thing that came to mind when I saw this gap between actionable mutations and targeted therapy prescriptions was, oh, maybe the physicians don't understand the data, or it's not being interpreted in a way that they understand. But that's too simple of an answer. There's many reasons for why we could have that gap, but we can begin to ask those questions. Why are they? Why aren't we using this optimally, and how can we? So
Great.
Hopefully we can have that results out and published soon so that we can see the real value and how to go forward.
Sounds good. Thanks, Daryl. Thanks for setting the stage for tantalizing us with data that will be emerging soon. Why don't we work back up and let's switch gears to solutions and solutions within your own institutions. David, you mentioned payment challenges, challenges with physician behavior, challenges with interpretation of results. Maybe you could walk us through how you attack this challenge. Again, you were front and center to help piece this all together. So I think it'd be a learning experience for all of us.
Sure. So the main mission of our Center for Precision Medicine is implementation, and we have been working with the leadership in oncology and in diagnostics to figure out how do we create a routinized system so that physicians don't have to necessarily interpret the test themselves, for example. So let me just step back and say, in this study of the first 1,000 patients, one of the surprising findings was that virtually everybody who had an actionable mutation that would specify an FDA-approved drug, if they were still alive at the time, at the appropriate time, they got the drug. And I think that really says something about the highly motivated, relatively small group of physicians that are at our main hospital. The second finding, which I think is very much in line with what Lincoln Group has found, is that the median survival was twice the patients that had an actionable mutation versus the patients that we sequenced that we did not find an actionable mutation. Not exactly a control group. There might be something different, in the biology of people with actionable mutations and people without. But nevertheless, I was surprised that basically, 25–30% of the patients that should have gotten a therapy got it. They benefited clearly, and the cost analysis really looks like it's not as bad as you might think. Even though these folks are on very expensive oral medications, a lot of hospitalizations are avoided, and the actual numbers come out to be beneficial toward the side of targeted therapy, albeit they live longer. So I like having that problem. And so how do we make this, to even push this to one of our sister hospitals that is, walking distance for me down the road is a big challenge. And so we got a group together, we created diagnostic and practice guidelines, we built the appropriate infrastructure into the EMR. And this was a big project. It actually cost a reasonable amount of money to do this, but now I think we can be fairly sure that we're really trying to minimize the variations in practice. And we had to redo the whole thing when the immunotherapy revolution hit, and immunotherapy became frontline for non-small cell lung cancer. And I think we'll just have to keep redoing it every few months, which again is not a bad problem to have, considering we're seeing these survival increases. So it's a lot of work. It takes highly motivated teams. It takes people who are skilled in building things in the EMR. And I think that brings one of the big challenges, I think, is that any change you make to the EMR can change physician workflow. And since physicians are basically being paid these days by the RVU, anything that slows them down causes a lot of ramifications. And I think we're going to have to come to grips with how do we work with these dominant EMR companies to find creative solutions to some of these workflow issues. But I think it can be done.
So you outlined the approach at University of Pennsylvania, and what I'm going to ask you to think about is, and then we'll come back to you, is a couple things you mentioned: 1,000-patient study. You mentioned reaching out to your sister hospitals, and I think it goes back to a comment at the end of the last session, where actually not a comment but a question. I think as the CEO of a diagnostic company sitting in the room, they're saying, oh, "Gosh, we wish those were our problems." And so where I'll come back to you, kind of in the next round of questions, is how can you take what you learned through developing that study, getting all the appropriate folks together, what you learned when you reached out to your sister hospital, recognizing the challenge that you just stated it was, even though it's part of the system, right? It should be straightforward. You say, go do this, and they do it. And we know it doesn't work that way. But I think what are the lessons for the broader audience as they're not trying to implement it at Penn, we're trying to implement it throughout the health system. So I'll give you time to think about that.
Thank you.
We jump over. As we let's jump over to Lincoln. Lincoln will have you do the same thing. Let's talk about how you approach this and how you work through those challenges that you outlined within Intermountain Health.
Well, so I mentioned 3 challenges: interpretation, implementation, and success metrics. And the first one, interpretation, we adopted what so many have adopted, which is a molecular tumor board. So we knew that frontline oncologists were nervous about interpreting these genomic test results, so we had a molecular tumor board actually review every single next generation sequencing test that was ordered. And what would go back to them and was actually included on the report was a molecular tumor board interpretation that was really simplified. Instead of listing the gene and the specific amino acid substitution and all of this language that reads like Greek, we excluded that and just put the gene and the drug that the molecular tumor board thought might be beneficial for that patient, and we listed it in a ranked order. We said, try it in this order, 1, 2, 3, here you go, and then they could do what they wanted. So for interpretation, that's what we did. For implementation, so I actually think that implementation...
Lincoln, did you need an army of people to do that? How many physicians did you need? Was it just a standard tumor board that you put together as you would in your ordinary course of just...
Well, so great question. It's very similar to just a standard tumor board. Okay. And some of my colleagues started joking that when they were going to the regular tumor board, they'd say, well, we're going to the analog tumor board today and not the molecular tumor board. And they also joked that they were treating their patients imprecisely when they weren't, and they were just giving them chemotherapy. And I agreed. I'm like, well, it is kind of imprecise, good luck. They do good. They do well. So this molecular tumor board, in our case, and there are different kinds all over the country, right? Some are just within an institution. Ours was interinstitutional, so we had colleagues from multiple institutions, Stanford and Providence and University of Colorado, and a mix of both academic and community hospital systems. And by expert, I mean someone who has some experience with genomics and interpretation. We had pharmacists, we had medical oncologists, we had some scientists, and we would review each case. And we didn't need an army. Typically, we would have anywhere from 5 to 10 people at each molecular tumor board, and that was kind of an external-facing one. And then we had an internal one that was smaller, where we could just crank through lots of tests. And we reserved what we thought were the easier ones for the smaller molecular tumor board, and the more complicated ones we would take to the larger molecular tumor board.
So I'm going to press one more question on that one before we move on. You met daily, weekly, biweekly, monthly, how often did the molecular tumor board? If you're asking for all the physicians that order these NGS-based tests, how often did they have to convene in order to work through these reports and to work through this data?
For the big one, for the more complicated cases, and that was the multi-institutional one, and I say external facing because we actually made it open so that anybody in the country actually that wanted to come and sit in and listen by WebEx, they could see and hear us, could, and we would send the link to whoever wanted to join. We did that every other week. And then the smaller internal one where we'd crank through, we did that 3 times a week.
Right, and the reason I'm pressing on this one is because in almost every discussion that I get into about finding a long-term solution here, whether I'm working with another company, with a health system, patient advocacy group, this notion of a molecular tumor board or a tumor board always comes up. And so maybe we can come back to it as we think about, what does that look like in terms of a national solution? It just comes up in almost every conversation that I have, and I just think it's something that maybe we could talk about a little bit more. But again, we have time to come back to that as well.
Yeah,
so thanks for sharing
the scaling
a little more insight.
Of that is a big point of discussion, and so we should talk about that. you know, on the interpretation side, or excuse me, implementation side, I actually think the implementation is the hardest part of all of this. I see all of this noise in the market around technologies and technologies going head to head and conversations about should we be doing exomes, should we be doing genomes. And I think those are good conversations. I like having those myself, but honestly, that is not where the vast majority of providers in this country are and won't be for a long, long time. I think where most of them reside, and this is true for health systems all over the place in hospitals and providers, is in this question of how do I even do this? I mean, we don't have, this has been a problem for a long time. We don't even have good adherence with standard guidelines for non-small cell lung cancer testing. We don't get in this country close to 100% compliance with EGFR and ALK testing in non-small cell lung cancer or BRAF testing in melanoma. That just doesn't happen. Even HER2 testing in breast cancer is not 100% adherence in this country. So getting, implementing next-gen sequencing for advanced cancer patients is even a layer more difficult than that. So we had to take some really pragmatic steps to try to get docs to change their behavior and start adopting this. And the pragmatic steps we took were, number one, we have a nurse navigator system. So anytime any patient within the Intermountain system is diagnosed with cancer, they get assigned to a nurse navigator, and that nurse navigator contacts the patient within 24 hours, holds their hand, talks them through what all the tests are that they're going to have done. And what we trained our nurse navigators to do was when that patient has a diagnosis of stage 4 disease, they need molecular testing. They have got to have a next-gen sequencing genomic test. So that helped. The number two thing that we implemented was we made it a board goal for our entire health system. And we said in the year 2016, for example, our board goal was that every patient in the system who had metastatic cancer, they would get a genomic test. And so all of our physicians knew that was part of their board goals. And those two, and then the third thing that we implemented was we made the ordering of the test really easy. So it was actually proposed to them by the nurse navigator, and all they had to do was approve it. So those three things actually increased our test ordering dramatically. Before we implemented those, I think we had about 20% of our advanced stage cancer patients getting next-gen sequencing tests. And after we implemented that, we were well over 80%. So it made a huge difference. And I think if in this country we spent more time worrying about how to implement and a little less time debating about which technology is the most sensitive and can we get the variant allele fraction, and which liquid biopsy test is going to be more sensitive. No one cares about that, honestly. I mean, the frontline providers don't know and don't want to know. They don't want to know if you're down to 2% or 1% or 0.5%. They just want to know, what do I do when I get the test result? How do I get the drug? And then can I monitor the outcomes of these patients?
So I see, David, I see you nodding your head yes with a lot of these comments. Darryl, I couldn't see you, but I assume you were you're going along with a number of them as well. A question that I'll throw out before we turn it over to the audience, and that is, again, there are common themes that always come up in these discussions. Molecular tumor board, ease of implementation. Of course, payment always comes up, but generating the appropriate data. You're recruited out tomorrow, you start a personalized medicine, or you're recruited in to run a personalized medicine company, whether it's focusing on the therapeutic side or diagnostic side. First day on the job, you have to start thinking through implementation, not at the University of Pennsylvania, not within Intermountain Health, but you have to think about it from a very different perspective. Would one of you want to take a crack? Again, all three of you, would one of you want to take a crack at maybe some of the first things that you would think through if you had to work through these challenges, not from your current institution, but from an outsider's perspective, because that's what a lot of us are in the room are faced with every single day.
Well, one of the interesting problems, you mentioned nurse navigators, which we have as well, but yep. we had to get tissue navigators, because one of the problems that non-pathologists may not think about is you got to wrangle the tissue from someplace. Somebody has an outside biopsy. In fact, we have a hard time figuring out if they've had testing done on the outside. You ask the patient, have you had a genomic test done? They're like, huh? So it's, we have people who've had tests done. We can't figure out who did them or, what the situation is, so we have to redo a test. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. So some information clearinghouse would be incredibly helpful. I think that in general, there needs to be someone who is who is knowledgeable in that particular cancer disease area, like lung, breast, whatever, who would be available to answer questions. Because I'm not sure that, you know, automated decision support and reports that specify, you know, in detail what the physician should do is going to go down well with everybody. I think they need somebody that they have some relationship with that they can call up and get
I think
advice.
having the relationship is key, because so many physicians, we learned this at Foundation Medicine, not just in the early days, but even as we look back a year or two ago, it's remarkable how many times someone would reach out to a client's office and say, by the way, did you have any questions on that report? We didn't hear from you. And it turned out the physician was kind of embarrassed to pick up the phone and call.
Yeah.
And I imagine that's magnified 100-fold in an institution like Penn.
And I think physicians feel dumb when they see
Right.
a genomics report and they don't understand it. Then they feel dumb. Then no one likes to feel dumb, so they don't reach out. They don't talk about it.
Or they don't order it.
They don't order.
They don't
right,
order.
Exactly.
Terrell.
So a lot of what we have done is looked at all of the challenges in implementing personalized medicine holistically. And one of the things that Howard McLeod, who will be speaking tomorrow, suggested is that there's a linear progression, well, not linear, but a progression of strategies that need to be employed to deal with these challenges. So if we handle things on the front end, we're more equipped to handle challenges on the back end. So if the hardest challenges to overcome are about ensuring access to care from changing a cultural perspective, to get to that point, we need to, on the front end, deal with our education, our workforce education and awareness issues. And if we set up a system where we can handle patient empowerment, where we know how we're going to involve patients, well, then we can get to we could be more prepared to handle the challenges around information management and infrastructure development. And if we handle those challenges, we'll be more equipped to address the challenges around evidence development and value, which will then change the culture.
Okay, so let me nudge you a little bit. You said if we could do that. How does one do that in the real world? Like, is something that Howard's going to touch on tomorrow a little bit more, or you said if we could do these things?
Sure. The entire session tomorrow morning, I hope everybody will attend, will be on...
See, Ed, we're setting up tomorrow here already.
From concept to clinic, and some of the strategies that are being employed by different groups. But I think that Intermountain and Penn are doing those things as well. So the strategies that are being employed, we can then look at where we're getting successes and where the challenges have been more difficult than we had anticipated, and we need to start to devise new strategies.
You know, Mike, you asked this great question about what would you do if you were starting tomorrow, day one, at an institution. And you know, I love this question, and people have asked this before. The very first thing I would do is set up a way to monitor outcomes for patients. That's when you have that outcomes data, you know, you're totally justified in everything that you do, and people will listen to data. So that's the first thing I do. And the second thing I would do is partner. I would look for partners. This space, this precision medicine space, is full of people that are willing to partner. Historically, health systems, in my opinion, have been bad partners. I just don't think that they have historically thought about working with industry very well. And I would say at Intermountain for a long time, we haven't been great partners with industry, and that has really changed recently. And I think that's true for lots of health systems. I mean, you know, here's Mark Williams sitting here in the front, and what they've done at Geisinger is a perfect example of the benefit, you know, the mutual benefit that can come with the right kinds of partnerships. And I think if I were starting tomorrow, I would look for, you know, outstanding partners that help me in industry that would help me accomplish what I'm trying to do.
I'd negotiate for a bigger budget.
Why don't we take let's feel free to start lining up for questions, but go ahead, question one. We only have another 2 hours, so
Sure. Amit Rastogi, Nova Health System. Two-part question for Lincoln and David. One, I know you jokingly said about the budget, but you know, outside of having to fund all of the testing or any of the treatments outside of your own budgets, how have you seen, especially, I know, Lincoln, you mentioned that you do have some data that's going to be coming out. How have you seen, if at all, the nature of your discussions with payers changing? And number two, I know you both talked about the challenges with trying to educate physicians. I'd like to hear a little bit more in terms of what you're trying to do programmatically to bridge that gap.
You know, we've seen a huge change in our access to drug. And when we first implemented precision medicine and we would find a therapy that we thought made sense based on a patient's genomics, it was typically an off-label indication. And we often heard no from payers, understandably, and that's been their dogma and position for a long time. And we did a couple of things. First of all, we started partnering more with them. And I think that too often we think of payers as this anonymous, faceless, third-party group, and they're not. They're our partners. And we should think of them as health plans is really the right way there. And so we started partnering and talking through with them what we were trying to achieve. And then we did kind of pragmatic things too, like we went through the entire appeals process. And I sat in on a lot of these administrative law judge hearings. And they would invite the patients to that. And that was really painful. And the health plans didn't really like that very much. And after a while, when they saw we were serious and we were talking to them about partnering, I think we came to a mutual understanding that that there are patients that would benefit from in some of these cases. So we saw a big shift, and we rarely hear no now. So that's been successful.
Yeah, I think that's it. The perception and the attitudes have shifted, but I think if we can publish these papers, it will be important, because I still get the, yeah, but this is a waste of money kind of argument, and I think these three studies need to get out there.
Yeah. Great. Next question.
Phil Lemming, Christ Health Network in Cincinnati. This is on the education gap. Given the somewhat psychotic world we live in medicine, with healthcare, electronic medical records, time limitations, in places that even have enormously good clinicians, I see the education gap is huge.
Yeah.
So the question is, in your experience on both of your institutions, what have you done, or how have you implemented cross-network education to bring up and narrow that education gap so people can utilize these systems, be aware of it, and do a better job with ultimately patient care?
And as you answer that question, think about, again, how it might apply to a broader audience and to folks outside of Intermountain Health and University of Pennsylvania as well.
Well, we have scaled to, I guess, 5 hospitals at this point. I think we're about to be 6. I can't imagine scaling bigger than that, but this effort, the education effort, really involves a dedicated set of teams in the cancer. All the different cancer disease sites have teams with leaders, and those teams go out regularly to the other hospitals, provide educational CME courses. They sit in on the local tumor boards. They spend a lot of time educating on, this is the PIN pathway for non-small cell lung cancer, this is the PIN pathway for ovarian cancer, and we basically just reinforce and tell people drink the Kool-Aid. It takes a lot of work.
It does take a lot of work, and the absolute 2 ingredients you have to have are, number one, a physician champion. You have to have someone within the institution who sees patients, who understands this vision and champions it and talks about it. And the second key ingredient is an administrative champion. You have to have someone on the administrative side who will help overcome the inevitable barriers that will arise. And then I've been constantly surprised at how much the molecular tumor board helped, honestly. We would invite, every time someone ordered a genomic test, we would invite them to the molecular tumor board, and we have seen a great improvement in the overall comfort of our providers in acting on molecular tumor board interpretations, and often not necessarily needing that or waiting for that. So that's been a huge help. And then, just as David said, there's a certain amount of hand-to-hand combat that has to go on. You have to, sometimes you have to pick up the phone and you just call and talk to docs and walk them through it. And you only have to do that once or twice, and they will catch on. But
I do have a funny story from the early days. We went out to one of our partner hospitals that I won't name, but it's a pretty large hospital in its own right. They did not want our gigantic 35 gene solid tumor panel that we developed in the early days. That's too many genes, that's too much information, so we had to develop a custom 5-item panel for those guys. And you can imagine how much it costs to develop and validate, a test like this. They used it twice and then switched to the normal panel, but
So it was still a means to an end.
Yeah.
But
Let me just point out in the education space as well, as I've gone around, there's been a lot of creative and interesting strategies on how to educate workforce and the doctors. The physician champion and the administrative champion are absolutely key, but I've also seen examples such as at Mayo, they have these modules of learning about different personalized medicine areas within their individualized medicine institute that they make their workforce watch and get CE credits for. And a really interesting strategy is happening at Inova Health Center in Northern Virginia with their Medimap program. And to help educate doctors about that, they gave the test to all of the doctors who are administering it and talked about the results, so they were vested in it. And I think that was a great way to educate workforce.
Yeah, and these are, I talked to a lot of institutions, and these are common themes. And the other thing that, Lincoln, you mentioned earlier, which I think, I know put a punctuation mark on it at Memorial Sloan Kettering, is when Jose Baselga actually put it in each physician's annual goals. They had to hit X percentage of patients who ended up getting molecularly profiled at their institution, and that was the final piece. It was, you have to keep hammering, but also put it into the metrics. Now I'm still thinking through how, from an industry standpoint, we can, that's more from the healthcare system itself, but we should come back to that. And frankly, if any audience members have any suggestions on how we, how we think through that with our health system partners or with our provider partners, that'd be helpful to hear. Next question.
So this is a great panel. What I really like is you have academia, mission, policy-based, Intermountain in its healthcare standpoint and service provision. And so I represent Dignity Health and Catholic Health Initiatives, so much larger than 3, 4, 5 hospitals. It's at scale. And so I love the question about what you do first, but maybe just to mix it up a bit, because we hear many things over and over, and the diversity of perspectives I think is great on this panel. But what do you think in 5 years we're going to laugh about what we did now?
Hopefully a lot.
Yeah. But I mean, because you each bring a different perspective in how you connect into the ecosystem and to the way in which the different economies come to bear in healthcare, industry, other, academia and grants. But from the most macro level of access, what are the things you think we're going to be most wrong about in the future?
I think it's 3 things. I think we're going to laugh that we used to worry about the cost. I think we're going to laugh that we used to worry about whether there's clear evidence of utility. And I think we're going to laugh that we relied so heavily on molecular tumor boards.
Because there'll be technology solutions instead?
There will be technology solutions, yeah, absolutely. I think the knowledge will be ubiquitous, and I think it'll be democratized, and I think this, cost continues to come down. I think payers, the utility case is becoming clear. I think 5 years from now, we won't even ask those questions, honestly.
I feel like we should just end the session right now.
We're done.
We're not ending, so good.
Well, we're always going to have to get outcomes data and cost data, and I hope we're going to laugh in 5 years at how difficult it was back here to get the data. That's a challenge for somebody out there.
Yeah.
Darryl, as somebody that's not a provider, you're looking at it from a slightly different perspective. How would you answer the question?
Well, I agree 100% with Lincoln that we're so tied up in trying to get the evidence for clinical utility, and I think that's going to be obvious once we do. And we'll look back and say, I can't believe that was the case. But I'm also hoping that, and I expect as well, that this conversation that has begun over the last 5 years about patient-centeredness will be well beyond that. And we'll look back, and I don't think we'll laugh at it, but we'll remember these days as when we rightfully brought patients into the conversation and figured out how to, and how much that improves care. I think that's a big part of it.
Great point. Next question.
I'm not going to ask you anything about cost. I'm just going to ask you about bioethics. There's a narrow window in time when studies like this make sense, right? There's got to be enough promise in the diagnostic screening for it even to be sensible to ask the question. But the evidence for the value of it can't be so incontrovertible that we're really obliged to do it. We can't randomize anymore. Lincoln, you mentioned randomizing, and David, I don't remember if I heard you mention randomizing patient groups or not, or whether you were looking retrospective or how you were doing it. But I was just curious about what, if any, IRB challenges you met with in these undertakings, or that you might imagine having met with that could affect others who are thinking about undertaking similar kinds of demonstration projects?
Yeah, great question. You know, actually in our study, just one small point of clarification, in the study that we published, we actually didn't randomize. It was a retrospective matched cohort study. But, you know, in my opinion, patients with advanced cancer are entitled to a fully informed treatment decision. I think every physician, when they're designing a treatment plan and pathway for their patient, should have all of the information possible, including a full genomic analysis. I think devising a treatment plan in the absence of full genomic analysis is an incomplete plan. You know, in terms of the question about IRB, we ran into some questions about how would we return results if we thought we had found a germline mutation, for example. And so we implemented, you know, a genetic counseling system that all questionable cases were referred to them, and then they would discuss it with the patient. We did not run into any questions from IRB about equipoise. You know, they felt like these questions were real questions, and that these were we were asking them the right way. Patients asked that, though. Patients would say, well, how come, you know, I want to get genomic analysis. I want to get that right now. And a lot of patients were asking that when they had stage 2 or stage 1 disease, and that wasn't part of our treatment paradigm. We're not doing regular molecular profiles on stage 1 breast cancers because the utility case just isn't there. So we ran into that occasionally.
And in our case, I think a limitation, so the reason we were able to do our study and from an ethical standpoint was, although biologically the study could be seen as flawed, it was the patients who, everybody was sequenced, as the patients who had an actionable mutation, you know, did they get treatment and what happened, versus the patients who did not have an actionable mutation. So everybody was treated, you know, appropriately according to what we think standard of care, you know, the higher level of standard of care based on genomic guided therapies. And my lead singer wrangled the, Peter, wrangled the IRB. So thank God I didn't have to do that.
I think we'll go back to the left. Yes.
So about that, actually, that's a perfect segue to my question. So for the patients who don't have an actionable alteration, which we all know is actually still pretty high in this population, how do you prove the value of even the testing costs for those kinds of patients in a general perspective?
Well, I would, this is not my area of expertise, but if you have a shot at getting double the survival at a similar cost, I think, you know, it's worth taking the test. That's just a sort of a lay view of that question.
Yeah, I think the two ways we observe value in that setting is we saved patients from getting treatments that may not have been beneficial for them, right? Because we ruled out, or we found a KRAS mutation, right? So now they don't have to get EGFR inhibitors and rashes, et cetera. But the second way is, and this was more subtle, but we found this a lot with patients, that it bought a certain amount of peace of mind. So patients felt like they had gotten cutting edge care. You know, even if they're not flying to Memorial Sloan Kettering or MD Anderson or one of the major academic centers, they feel like they're getting precision medicine and the current, you know, cutting edge available analysis of their tumor. And that is worthwhile to patients and their families. They just want to know that.
Yeah, it's what is the cost of not testing is one of the ways that we refer to that. But you're getting the best care with the test, and even if you don't have an actionable mutation, you know you've had that, and it relieves your mind.
Yeah, Mark Williams Geisinger. It's great listening to Lincoln. I'm having flashbacks. We didn't cross paths at Intermountain, but I spent 7 years there running a genetics institute prior to Lincoln coming. I like to think we plowed the ground just a bit.
You did.
But for us in 2005 was having a genetic counselor sit in at the analog tumor board and say, did you take a family history? Yeah. So we've come quite a ways, I think, over that time. And I also share your pain with the administrative law judge hearings. That's no fun, and you too. Yeah. So I wanted to respond to a solution question that you asked, and that is coming back to something that you said, Lincoln, about the idea that we can't even follow the regular guidelines that are out there, much less the molecular stuff. And one of the things that Geisinger has done has been to protocolize these guidelines in as much as possible. And while a lot of institutions have done that, what we've done is actually be able to export that and find that it actually works in other systems through something that's called proven care. And in fact, we have a proven care non-small cell lung cancer protocol that we're working with a professional society where we just expanded, I think now to 18 institutions that are running the proven care non-small cell lung cancer protocol, where it takes the NCCN guidelines, ASCO guidelines, and other things, and runs them. And all of the institutions, which range from academic medical centers to small community hospitals, have basically met what would be considered to be adequate guideline compliance. Now, the problem with guidelines, as you well know, is we don't like to make them adequately explicit. We tend to put in a lot of weasel words, like you might consider, or you may do. So you have to have experts that basically come together and say, well, this is what we think the evidence supports doing. Now, what I don't think we've done, because I haven't been involved in this, is to actually add now the molecular component to that. But it would be relatively straightforward to build that into the protocol to make sure that the sequencing is done and that you have then a decision tree based on what the sequencing results show to get targeted therapy. But that type of an implementation works.
Yeah, you just have to be prepared to change it frequently.
That's part of, well, at Intermountain, the process there, as Lincoln is well aware, is that the people that are in charge of guidelines are required to know what's going to be happening 6 months ahead of when the guideline is coming. In other words, the unpublished literature and that sort of thing. And they are required to update those guidelines at a minimum of yearly and faster if there's a significant evidence change. And so you're absolutely right. The maintenance of those are not fire and forget. It's dynamic, and you have to have the outcomes capture on the back end to inform. So you really have to close that loop, and I'll talk more about that.
So what I love about that is I actually think that even goes a hair beyond clinical decision support, right? We always talk about CDS, but really this is protocolized, and that's different, and I think that's the way you accomplish this. I also think that health plans, i.e. payers, have a fairly big lever. We have our own health plan at Intermountain, and they are talking about this. Should we really pay for a platinum doublet in a lung cancer patient that might land them in the hospital if that patient hasn't had standard EGFR ALK testing, PD-L1 testing, et cetera. So I think there are multiple stakeholders that can pull levers to help with compliance.
And I think we have time for one more question, and in the event that Ed cuts us off after that question, I want to add something real quickly. Before we have time for two more, plus I'll make a comment. The comment is that one of the reasons that I was so supportive of Vice President Biden's initiative is that it forced people like this to get in a room, and it was going to do it much more effectively. It was going to force the Lincolns and the Davids and the Marks of the world and so many folks to get together and talk about the solutions that they've implemented in their own systems and start to share ideas. We have to do more of this, and I know that many of these things should be driven, I think, on the private side, but the singular thing that I was most excited about with the moonshot-related initiatives is that they just forced people to talk who didn't necessarily talk either not because they didn't like each other, because they were too darn busy and they weren't forced to do it. And I think that's something that maybe somehow we can think about that even through the Personalized Medicine Coalition. So again, another quick advertisement there, but go ahead.
Julie Ramage from Pfizer Oncology. My question to you is in regards to tissue handling and tissue sufficiency. Did you track the cases that had come in and were tests not performed at the door, QNS? Did you go back and track what were the methodologies for extraction that were used and use that in your calculation? And did you develop a game plan of standardization from those tissue collectors on how they would handle it to the point where you actually took over and did the testing?
I love that question. Do you want to?
Well, as a pathology chair, I can jump in on that one. But so yes, we did track that. We were at our initial work with the 35-something gene panel that eventually turned into 100 and something. We still don't have a really big one. About 8 or 9% were quantity not sufficient, and so we developed a completely actionable panel that's much smaller that we do that actually one of the papers I'm proud of that I'm on is in cancer cytopathology, because I said we've got to be able to do something with cytopath specimens, and it turns out alcohol-fixed specimens work really, really well for NGS, and so we generally can get it from an FNA or from a small sample, and now the QNS rate is like 1%, and in that void comes liquid biopsy.
You know, gosh, your numbers are awesome. When we first started, our QNS rate was around 20%, and it was really high. It was so frustrating. We'd even have patients who went and got a biopsy specifically for molecular testing who'd then have QNS, and try to explain that to a patient. That's a disaster. And so we took a twofold approach. We worked with, we educated our interventional radiologists and others who are getting the biopsies and talked to them about, let's get a few more cores as long as you're in there. And then we worked on the lab side to really improve our extraction techniques and other techniques. And so now our QNS rate is down below, well, it's around 5% or so. And our director, Jason Gilman, is sitting up there in the presidential box. He sweated bullets over this for a long time. And he could tell you all about it. But yes, that's a great point. It was a huge headache, and you've got to get those QNS rates down.
I'm Francis Quetier from France, Genoscope and Genopole. I would like to raise the question of the relative value of achieving only a whole exome sequencing. Because when you do that, you are pretty sure and absolutely sure to miss two informations. The first one deals with the microRNA, and we have to keep in mind that there are now over 1,000 of microRNA, and a significant part of these are already associated with various diseases. And the second information which is missing at the end is the mutation, which are more rare, more scarce, dealing with the presence of mutation in the promoters and in the associated enhancer and silencer. So I would prefer to favor the transcriptomic approach. If there is an effect, you have obligatory transcription, and you can go back to the information which is missing. What is the reason why this RNA is over or underexpressed?
Just from a high-level perspective, I think this question falls into the category of what in 5 to 7 years from now will we smile about, and I think we'll smile that we used to debate how much information to get, because I think the cost will come down and our ability to interpret and apply that information will improve. And I think in the future we'll see patients have whole exome, whole transcriptome analyses, but I think it'll take a while to get there. There's no question that the science is indicating that's relevant. I love watching what happens at AACR, and then 4 to 5 years later, seeing it implemented at ASCO. And everyone at ASCO is talking about liquid biopsy like it's the greatest thing. And 5 years ago, AACR was like, yeah, we solved that. You guys are still worrying about how to implement that? So I think this is where microRNAs, transcriptomes, and all of that fits in.
Yeah, and then from the pathology perspective, again, there are a number of reasons we resist doing exomes. One of them is that we would have to do a germline comparison, and the mandated germline reporting results would cripple the health system at this point, partly due to a lack of genetic counselors, and it's just right now that's an intractable problem. And the other problem is that we don't have enough brain power, we can't afford to interpret these really large amounts of information. We'd have to hire too many physicians. Our children's hospital is going broke in the pathology department because they're doing the Diagnostic Odyssey exomes, and it takes like 25, 30 people that are all paid a reasonable salary, and it's just not, that just doesn't work. So when informatically, when this is all, a nice little black box that works beautifully, that'll be the day.
So I hope the takeaway message from this panel is that the answers to so many of our challenges are actually in this room. We just have to find a way to share and work together and just keep pushing discussions like this. So thanks, Ed. Thanks to the panel.
Slot, and the answer is we saved the best for last.
There you go.
So please join me in thanking Mike and the panel. before you get up, I just want to say that this conversation is going to begin. It's going to continue tomorrow, and anybody who reads the case on Intermountain tonight to prepare to discuss it with Professor Hammermesh tomorrow, and really what is a highlight of this conference, and it's the only conference where I know of that where you have an interactive business school discussion. The case on Intermountain is available at the PMC desk in the front, and I encourage everybody to read it. And then thirdly, I want to invite everybody to join us for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres upstairs now.